The porch light never went out. For 3 decades, it has burned above the steps where Trent DeGuiro took his last breath on a humid Kentucky night in 1994. Students replaced the bulb when it dimmed. Neighbors paid the electric bill when apartments changed hands. The light became a shrine to questions that refused to die. 21 years old. Football scholarship, birthday celebration that should have been perfect. Instead, a single rifle shot from the shadows split time in half before and after. The investigation that followed consumed detectives, shattered a family, and haunted a community that learned to live with the weight of the unknown. But some secrets refused to stay buried. When Shane Ragland's ex-girlfriend finally spoke his name in a police station 5 years later, she carried more than accusations. She carried a wire. The confession that followed would shock Lexington, divide a courtroom, and prove that even when justice stumbles, truth finds a way to surface. What drives a man to kill over a fraternity slight? And what happens when the law itself becomes the final battleground between guilt and freedom? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time, right now. The campus air hung thick with July heat as sunset painted the University of Kentucky rooftops amber and gold. Music drifted from crowded apartment windows where summer students gathered in celebration. Among them, in a modest off-campus unit, laughter spilled from the living room where Trent DeGuiro wore his blue jersey like a badge of honor. At 21, Trent carried himself with the quiet confidence of a young man who understood his purpose. His teammates surrounded him, raising beer bottles in mock salute to another year of life. The apartment buzzed with the easy warmth of friendship young men bound by shared dreams and Saturday afternoons under stadium lights. "Speech! Speech!" someone called from the kitchen doorway. Trent grinned, shaking his head. "Y'all know I'm better with a football than a microphone." The room erupted in good-natured groans. Outside, the sun disappeared behind campus buildings, leaving only streetlights to illuminate the quiet residential street. A car sat parked across from the apartment, its occupant invisible in the gathering darkness. Inside, the celebration continued. Trent had turned down an NFL scout meeting that week, choosing instead to focus on his friends and his final semester. The local papers had dubbed him a hometown hero, the kid from South Oldham High who carried Kentucky pride in every touchdown. As the night deepened, guests began to drift away. Textbooks called. Morning classes loomed. By midnight, only a handful remained, nursing the last of the beer and trading stories about upcoming seasons. Trent stepped onto the porch for air, cigarette smoke curling in the humid night. The clock in the living room ticked toward 3 in the morning. Quiet settled over the porch like a blanket. Trent sat on the concrete steps, cigarette glowing between his fingers. The party had wound down to whispers and the soft clink of bottles being cleared from tables. Through the screen door came muffled laughter from the few friends who remained. The street lay empty except for scattered cars and the yellow glow of streetlights. A gentle breeze carried the scent of summer grass and distant barbecue smoke from other gatherings across campus. Trent took a long drag, exhaling slowly into the night air. 3 blocks away, hidden in the darkness of a parking garage, a rifle sight found its target. The crack split the silence like thunder. Trent slumped forward, cigarette falling from lifeless fingers. Blood spread across the concrete steps as his body came to rest against the porch railing. The bullet had traveled with deadly precision, finding its mark from an elevated angle that spoke of calculated planning. Inside the apartment, conversation stopped. Someone dropped a rise bottle. Glass shattered. "Did you hear that?" "What was?" The screen door flew open. Friends rushed outside, their celebration turning to horror in seconds. Screams pierced the night as they found Trent motionless on the steps, his life stolen by a shooter who had already melted back into the darkness. 911 calls flooded the dispatch center. "Shots fired on Transcript Avenue. We need ambulances now." Radio news would interrupt programming within the hour. University athlete gunned down in apparent sniper attack. By dawn, yellow tape surrounded the apartment. Detectives arrived to find a scene that would haunt them for years. The birthday celebration frozen in time, beer bottles still warm on the coffee table, and a young man's dreams scattered like blood across summer concrete. The shell casing was never found. No witnesses saw the shooter. The precision of the shot suggested military training or hunting experience, but the motive remained a ghost in the Kentucky night. Sunrise painted Lexington in shades of tragedy. Police cruisers lined Transcript Avenue while crime scene technicians combed every inch of the apartment complex. The detective stood on the porch where Trent had died, his weathered face grim as he studied the blood-stained concrete. 26 years on the force had taught the detective to read violence like a book. This shooting told a story of patience and planning. The killer had waited in darkness, positioned himself for a clear shot, and vanished without leaving evidence behind. Ballistics indicate a high-powered rifle, the coroner reported, kneeling beside chalk outlines that marked where Trent's body had fallen. Long-range capacity. Professional grade. The detective nodded, scanning the surrounding buildings. Across the street, a parking garage offered perfect elevation and multiple escape routes. A neighbor had heard a car engine start seconds after the shot, the only clue to the killer's presence. Students gathered beyond. The police tape, their faces pale with shock. The University of Kentucky had seen its share of campus crime, but nothing like this. Fear rippled through dormitories and fraternity houses as word spread that a sniper had targeted one of their own. Any threats against the victim? The detective asked the responding officer. Nothing documented. Kid was clean. No enemies we can find. The detective's radio crackled with updates from the scene. No fingerprints on the building where the shot originated. No surveillance cameras captured the parking garage. The killer had chosen his position with military precision. By noon, media trucks lined the street. Headlines screamed across local papers. UK football player murdered in sniper attack. The story would dominate news cycles for weeks, then gradually fade as leads evaporated and attention turned to other tragedies. But for the detective, this case would never fade. He would carry the file in his truck, revisiting witness statements during lunch breaks and analyzing ballistics reports until his eyes burned. The shot that killed Trent DiGiro had been fired from exactly 347 feet away, a distance that separated amateur from expert, impulse from calculation. Somewhere in Lexington, a killer walked free, believing he had committed the perfect crime. The South Oldham High School gymnasium had never held so many people. Every seat was filled, with mourners standing along the walls and spilling into the hallways. Tina DiGiro sat in the front row, her husband's hand clasped in hers, watching as an entire community came to honor their son. The casket sat beneath the basketball hoops where Trent had once played pickup games during football off-season. Flowers covered every available surface, roses from teammates, lilies from professors, daisies from classmates who barely knew him but understood the weight of his loss. Trent DiGiro embodied everything we hope our young men will become, the pastor said, his voice echoing through the packed gymnasium. He was a student, an athlete, a friend, and above all, a young man who made every day count. Tina's breath caught. Those words, "make every day count," had been written on a note they found in Trent's locker after his death. His handwriting, scrawled on a piece of notebook paper and tucked behind his playbook like a personal reminder. Teammates spoke of his leadership, coaches remembered his work ethic, friends shared stories of his humor and loyalty. But it was the silence between the words that spoke loudest, the future that would never unfold, the dreams that died on porch steps 3 nights earlier. The governor attended, along with university officials and NFL scouts who had been preparing to offer Trent a professional contract. The small-town football player had become a symbol of Kentucky pride, and his murder felt like an attack on the entire state. As the service concluded, thousands filed past the casket. Many left flowers. Others whispered prayers. All carried the same question that haunted the detective and would consume the DiGiro family for years to come. Who had wanted Trent dead, and why? Outside the gymnasium, the detective pulled Tina aside. "We're going to find who did this," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I give you my word." Tina nodded, tears streaming down her face. She believed him then, trusted that justice would come swiftly for her son. She had no way of knowing that they would wait 6 years for their first real lead, and that even then, the truth would prove more elusive than anyone imagined. The years between 1995 and 1999 passed like a slow bleed for the DiGiro family. The detective reopened the file every few months, spreading crime scene photos across his desk and searching for patterns he might have missed. The case had become personal, a reflection of his failure to protect the innocent. University life moved on. New students filled the dorms where Trent's friends once lived. The apartment on Transcript Avenue was rented to others who knew nothing of the blood that had stained its porch steps. But the questions lingered like smoke from a fire that refused to die. The detective interviewed every party guest again, cross-referencing their statements with phone records and university enrollment data. He studied fraternity rosters, looking for connections between Trent and potential enemies. Most leads led nowhere, young men settling scores with fists, not rifles. One name surfaced repeatedly in witness interviews: Shane Ragland, a former acquaintance of Trent's who had been present at various campus events over the years. Several people remembered tension between them at a fraternity party, something about Ragland being excluded from rush activities, but the conflict seemed minor, hardly motivation for murder. The detective drove to Ragland's apartment 3 times during those years, watching from his unmarked car as the young man came and went. Raglan appeared normal, working construction jobs, dating various women, living the routine life of a college dropout trying to find his place in the world. The detective ran background checks, searching for signs of violence or military training that might explain the precision of the shot. Raglan had no criminal record, no known access to high-powered rifles, no apparent motive for targeting Trent. The connection felt too thin to pursue aggressively. Local media dubbed it the porch killing, running anniversary stories that gradually moved from front page to back section. Public interest waned as other crimes captured attention. The case file grew thick with dead ends and speculation, but no closer to truth. The detective kept a photo of Trent on his desk, the young man in his blue jersey, smiling at the camera during happier times. Each morning, the detective would look at that photo and promise to find answers. Each night, he went home knowing he had failed. Again, the file gathered dust until the spring of 2000, when everything changed with a phone call from a woman whose conscience could no longer bear the weight of what she knew. The police station interview room felt smaller than its 8 by 10 dimensions, cramped with the weight of secrets finally demanding release. The detective sat across from a woman whose hands trembled as she lit her third cigarette in 10 minutes. Her name was the ex-girlfriend Shane Raglan's former lover, and her story would crack the case wide open. "I dated Shane for about 2 years," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was different when we were alone, angry, always talking about people who had wronged him." The detective leaned forward, tape recorder spinning silently between them. "Tell me about Trent DeGiro." The ex-girlfriend's face went pale. Shane hated him, obsessed over him, said Trent had humiliated him at some fraternity thing, made him look stupid in front of everyone. But it wasn't just that. Shane was jealous of everything Trent had, the football scholarship, the respect, the future. Did he ever mention the shooting? The question hung in the air like poison. The ex-girlfriend took a long drag from her cigarette, gathering courage for the words that would change everything. "About a year after it happened, we were drinking at his apartment. Shane got this sick smile on his face and said he'd gotten even with Trent. Said he'd waited in that parking garage for hours, just watching the party through his rifle scope." The detective's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Those were his exact words? He described the shot, the distance, how Trent just dropped like a sack of grain. The ex-girlfriend's voice broke. He was proud of it. Said it was the perfect revenge, no evidence, no witnesses. No way anyone could ever prove what he'd done. The detective studied her face, searching for signs of deception. Her fear seemed genuine, but after 6 years of false leads, he remained cautious. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "I was scared. Shane had a temper, and he knew where I lived. But I can't sleep anymore. Every time I see Trent's mother on TV, talking about justice." The ex-girlfriend stubbed out her cigarette with shaking fingers. "I have to do what's right." The detective reached across the table, his voice gentle but firm. "Would you be willing to help us get Shane to confess? We'd need you to wear a wire, record him talking about what he did." The ex-girlfriend's eyes widened with terror, but she nodded slowly. "If it means that family gets answers, I'll do it." The plan would take weeks to arrange, but for the first time in 6 years, the detective felt hope stirring in his chest. The airport cafe buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers and tearful goodbyes, but beneath the surface, an elaborate sting operation was unfolding. The ex-girlfriend sat at a corner table, her purse containing a sophisticated recording device that would capture every word of her conversation with Shane Raglan. The detective watched from across the terminal, positioned behind a newspaper but ready to intervene if the situation turned dangerous. FBI technicians monitored the audio feed from a van parked outside, ensuring every syllable would be preserved for courtroom testimony. Raglan arrived 15 minutes late, his casual swagger unchanged by the years since Trent's murder. He slid into the seat across from the ex-girlfriend, ordering coffee and making small talk about mutual friends. To any observer, they looked like former lovers meeting for closure. "I've been thinking about us a lot lately," the ex-girlfriend began, following the script they had rehearsed. "About all the things you told me when we were together." Raglan shrugged, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Ancient history, baby. We had some good times. You remember that night you told me about Trent, about what really, happened to him?" The question hit its target. Raglan's expression shifted, pride mixing with caution as he glanced around the cafe. "I might have mentioned something." "Why?" "I never told anyone, Shane. But sometimes I wonder if you were serious, or just trying to impress me." His ego took the bait. Leaning closer, Raglan lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, I was serious. Dead serious. You want to know how I did it?" For the next 23 minutes, recorded in crystal clarity, Shane Raglan confessed to the murder of Trent DeGiro. He described positioning himself in the parking garage, using a hunting rifle he'd borrowed from a friend. He detailed waiting for hours, watching the party through his scope until Trent finally stepped onto the porch alone. "One shot," he said with satisfaction. "Clean and perfect. Kid never knew what hit him." He explained his motive: revenge for being humiliated at a fraternity event where Trent had laughed at his attempts to join. The slight had festered for months, growing into an obsession that demanded blood. When the ex-girlfriend asked about evidence, Ragland smiled coldly. "I ditched the rifle in Kentucky Lake the next morning. Wore gloves the whole time. Even if they suspected me, they'd never prove it." The recording ended when Ragland excused himself to catch his flight. The ex-girlfriend remained at the table, tears streaming down her face as she realized the monster she had once loved. The detective approached, his expression grim with the knowledge that they finally had their killer, but the fight for justice was just beginning. The arrest warrant was signed at dawn on July 17, 2000, exactly 6 years after Trent DeGuiro's murder. The detective led a team of officers to Shane Ragland's modest duplex on the outskirts of Lexington, their vehicles surrounding the property in a coordinated strike designed to prevent escape. Ragland answered the door in boxer shorts and a University of Kentucky t-shirt, his confusion giving way to cold understanding as the detective read him his rights. Neighbors gathered on their porches, watching in disbelief as the man they knew as a quiet construction worker was handcuffed on his front lawn. "Shane Ragland, you're under arrest for the murder of Trent DeGuiro," the detective announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of 6 years spent pursuing justice. The suspect said nothing, his face a mask of calculated calm even as news crews descended on the scene. By noon, every television station in Kentucky was broadcasting breaking news: arrest made in 1994 porch killing. The Lexington Herald-Leader ran a banner headline asking the question on everyone's mind: justice at last? Ballistics experts immediately began reanalyzing evidence with Ragland's confession as their guide. The bullet trajectory from the parking garage matched his description perfectly, a 347-foot shot requiring both skill and patience. The angle of entry confirmed the killer had fired from an elevated position, exactly as Ragland had detailed on the surveillance tape. Friends and co-workers expressed shock at the arrest. "Shane was quiet, but he seemed normal," said a construction foreman who had worked with Ragland for 3 years. "I never would have imagined he was capable of something like this." But other acquaintances recalled strange moments that suddenly made sense. A former friend remembered Ragland's inappropriate pride when discussing perfect revenge scenarios. A hunting buddy noted his unusual interest in long-distance rifle techniques, despite claiming he only hunted deer at close range. Defense attorneys immediately questioned the evidence chain, arguing that the recorded confession had been obtained through manipulation and deceit. They painted the ex-girlfriend as a vindictive ex-lover seeking revenge, willing to manufacture evidence to destroy Ragland's life. The prosecutor countered that the confession contained details only the killer could know. The trajectory, the timing, the specific rifle caliber all matched the forensic evidence from 1994. As news of the arrest spread across Kentucky, reactions divided along lines of justice and legal procedure. Victims' rights advocates praised the breakthrough, while civil liberties groups questioned the ethics of using personal relationships to obtain confessions. For Tina DeGuiro, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. After 6 years of unanswered questions, she finally knew who had killed her son. But the legal battle was just beginning, and she understood that arrests don't always lead to convictions. The Fayette County Courthouse had never seen media attention like this. Camera crews from CNN, NBC, and CBS jockeyed for position outside the imposing brick building, while Court TV prepared for gavel-to-gavel coverage of what prosecutors called the most important murder trial in Kentucky history. Inside the packed courtroom, the prosecutor stood before 12 jurors, her voice steady and clear as she outlined the state's case against Shane Ragland. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to hear the defendant's own voice, confessing to the cold-blooded murder of Trent DeGuiro. His words, recorded in crystal clarity, will prove beyond any doubt that justice has finally found its way to this courtroom." The prosecution's opening statement focused on the recorded confession, playing excerpts that made jurors visibly uncomfortable. Ragland's casual tone as he described the killing, referring to Trent as a target and boasting about the precision of his shot, painted him as a remorseless killer motivated by petty jealousy. "The defendant didn't just murder Trent DeGuiro," the prosecutor continued. He stole a young man's future, shattered a family, and terrorized a community for 6 long years. Today, we ask you to hold him accountable for those crimes. The defense attorney presented a starkly different narrative in his opening statement. A veteran criminal lawyer known for his theatrical courtroom style, he immediately attacked the credibility of the confession and the woman who obtained it. My client stands accused based on the word of a vindictive ex-girlfriend who manipulated him into saying things that may or may not be true, the defense attorney argued. The ex-girlfriend had motive to destroy Shane Ragland, a relationship that ended badly. A woman scorned seeking the ultimate revenge. The defense attorney painted the recorded conversation as a setup, arguing that the ex-girlfriend had guided Ragland into making statements that sounded like confessions but could have been fantasy or exaggeration. He reminded jurors that no physical evidence directly linked his client to the crime scene. The state wants you to convict a man based on pillow talk recorded in secret, the defense attorney concluded. That's not justice, that's entrapment. The courtroom gallery was divided between supporters of both sides. Trent's family and friends filled the left side, many wearing blue ribbons in his memory. Ragland's relatives occupied the right, their faces reflecting disbelief and shame. Outside the courthouse, protesters held vigil with signs reading "Justice for Trent" and "End the Silence." Student groups from the University of Kentucky organized prayer circles, while victims' rights advocates distributed flyers calling for stronger prosecution of cold cases. The trial would consume 6 weeks of testimony, but the battle lines were already drawn. Everything would depend on whether 12 ordinary citizens believed the voice on that airport recording and whether confession alone was enough to convict a man of murder. The ex-girlfriend approached the witness stand like a woman walking to her own execution. 6 months of death threats and sleepless nights had taken their toll, but her voice remained steady as she swore to tell the truth about the man who had once shared her bed and her secrets. The prosecutor guided her through the timeline of her relationship with Shane Ragland, establishing the intimacy that had allowed such devastating confessions to flow freely between them. The courtroom fell silent as the ex-girlfriend described the night Ragland first admitted to killing Trent DiGiro. "We were drinking wine at his apartment," she testified, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Shane was in one of his moods, angry about work, angry about life. He started talking about people who had wronged him, and Trent's name came up. "What exactly did the defendant say about Trent DiGiro?" the prosecutor asked. The ex-girlfriend's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. "He said Trent had humiliated him at a fraternity party, made him look like a fool in front of everyone. Shane couldn't let it go. He said he'd gotten his revenge." The prosecutor played the airport recording, 23 minutes of Ragland's voice describing the murder in chilling detail. Jurors leaned forward, studying transcripts as the defendant's words filled the courtroom. "One shot, clean and perfect. Kid never knew what hit him." The ex-girlfriend explained how she had contacted police, driven by guilt and the realization that Trent's family deserved answers. "I couldn't live with knowing the truth and doing nothing," she said. "Trent was innocent. He didn't deserve what Shane did to him." The audio recording revealed Ragland's motive, revenge for being excluded from a fraternity where Trent was popular and respected. The confession contained details that only the killer could know: the specific parking garage, the borrowed hunting rifle, the victim's position on the porch steps. He bragged that no one could ever prove it. The ex-girlfriend continued. "Shane thought he'd committed the perfect crime. He was proud of what he'd done." Cross-examination was brutal. The defense attorney attacked the ex-girlfriend's credibility, her motives, and her mental stability. He suggested she had manipulated Ragland into making false statements, that the entire confession was a product of her vindictive imagination. "You hated my client for ending your relationship, didn't you?" the defense attorney demanded. "I hated what he'd done to Trent," the ex-girlfriend replied. "The relationship meant nothing compared to that. So you decided to destroy his life with lies?" "I decided to tell the truth. Shane destroyed his own life when he pulled that trigger." Public sympathies split between believers and skeptics. Some saw the ex-girlfriend as a courageous woman seeking justice for an innocent victim. Others viewed her as a vindictive ex-lover, willing to manufacture evidence for revenge. But her testimony had accomplished its primary goal, putting Ragland's own words before the jury in all their damning clarity. The cross-examination erupted into open warfare between prosecutor and defense attorney, their fundamental disagreement about truth and justice playing out before a riveted courtroom audience. The defense attorney attacked every aspect of the state's case with surgical precision, questioning not just the evidence but the very methods used to obtain it. The ex-girlfriend, the defense attorney, continued his assault. "You've testified that my client confessed to murder during pillow talk, but isn't it true that you were secretly recording him on behalf of police?" I wore a wire to the airport meeting, the ex-girlfriend admitted, but the confession I heard came months earlier, when we were still together. The defense attorney seized the opening. So the jury is expected to convict based on your memory of a conversation that happened years ago, while drinking, between former lovers engaged in intimate conversation? The prosecutor objected repeatedly, but the defense attorney pressed forward with his theory that the ex-girlfriend had manipulated the airport conversation to create a false confession. He played selected portions of the recording, highlighting moments where the ex-girlfriend seemed to guide Ragland's responses. Notice how the ex-girlfriend asks leading questions, the defense attorney argued. She's not seeking truth, she's manufacturing evidence. The defense attorney challenged the admissibility of the recording itself, citing federal wiretapping laws that required specific consent protocol. Technical legal arguments filled hours of testimony as experts debated recording statutes, chain of evidence procedures, and the constitutional implications of using intimate relationships to obtain confessions. The judge struggled to balance legal precedent with public demands for justice. His courtroom had become the focal point for national debates about surveillance, confession law, and the ethics of undercover operations. Legal scholars filed amicus briefs supporting both sides, turning the trial into a referendum on modern investigative techniques. Outside the courthouse, protesters held competing rallies. Victims' rights advocates demanded justice for Trent DiGiro, while civil liberties groups warned that accepting coerced confessions would undermine constitutional protections for all citizens. If we allow this type of evidence, the defense attorney argued during closing statements, we create a precedent that destroys the presumption of innocence. Anyone could be convicted based on the word of an ex-lover with an agenda. The prosecutor countered that the confession contained verifiable facts that only the killer could know. The defendant described details that match our forensic evidence exactly. The jury doesn't need to speculate about guilt, they can hear it in his own voice. The judge allowed the recording, but cautioned jurors to consider the circumstances under which it was obtained. Legal experts predicted the case would be appealed regardless of verdict, setting up a potential Supreme Court challenge that could reshape confession law nationwide. As closing arguments concluded, both sides understood that this trial would be remembered not just for its verdict, but for the legal precedents it established about privacy, manipulation, and the lengths to which society would go in pursuit of justice. The jury deliberated for 16 hours across 3 days, their voices sometimes audible through the courtroom walls as they wrestled with questions of evidence, credibility, and reasonable doubt. When they finally filed back into the courtroom, their faces revealed nothing of the verdict that would determine Shane Ragland's fate. The judge called for order as cameras focused on the jury foreman, a retired teacher whose steady demeanor had made him a natural leader during deliberation. The courtroom fell silent except for the whispered prayers of Trent DiGiro's family and the labored breathing of Shane Ragland. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreman's voice carried across the packed courtroom with finality that seemed to echo from the grave itself. "We find the defendant guilty." Tina DiGiro collapsed into her husband's arms. 6 years of grief and determination finally rewarded with the words she had prayed to hear. Behind her, friends and supporters wept openly, while across the aisle, Ragland's family sat in stunned silence. Shane Ragland himself showed no emotion, his face a mask of cold indifference even as the judge read the full verdict. Guilty of premeditated murder, guilty of lying in wait, guilty of using a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. The court finds the defendant guilty as charged, the judge announced. Sentencing will be held in 30 days. Outside the courthouse, Lexington erupted in celebration. Students from the University of Kentucky gathered in impromptu vigils, lighting candles and sharing memories of Trent DiGiro. Local news stations ran special reports titled "Justice at Last," while national media praised the persistence of investigators who had never given up hope. The prosecutor addressed reporters on the courthouse steps, flanked by the detective and members of the DiGiro family. "Today's verdict proves that justice delayed is not justice denied," she declared. "No matter how much time passes, no matter how cold a case becomes, truth has a way of surfacing." The defense attorney immediately announced plans to appeal, questioning both the evidence and the legal precedents that had allowed the recorded confession to be admitted. "This verdict was based on pillow talk and hearsay," he told reporters. "We will fight this conviction at every level of the appeals process." But for one afternoon, those concerns seemed distant. The community that had lived with unanswered questions for 6 years finally had closure. The young man who had died on porch steps in 1994 had received justice, and his killer would spend the rest of his life behind bars. the celebration would prove premature. The Kentucky Supreme Court's decision arrived like a thunderbolt 18 months after Ragland's conviction, shattering the carefully constructed case that had taken 6 years to build. In a 7-page opinion that would haunt everyone involved, the state's highest court ruled that the recorded confession had been improperly obtained and therefore inadmissible as evidence. The Chief Justice wrote the majority opinion, acknowledging the heinous nature of the crime while emphasizing the court's duty to protect constitutional principles. While we sympathize deeply with the victim's family and understand the public's desire for justice, we cannot allow convictions to stand when they are based on evidence obtained through violation of federal wiretapping statutes. The court found that the ex-girlfriend had acted as an agent of law enforcement when she recorded Ragland at the airport, making the confession subject to strict consent requirements that had not been properly followed. The prosecution's failure to obtain necessary federal approvals before authorizing the wire operation had tainted the entire recording. The Constitution protects all citizens from unreasonable search and seizure, the Chief Justice continued. This protection cannot be suspended, even in pursuit of justice for victims of violent crime. Tina DeGiro received the news by phone while working in her garden, the same flowers she had planted in Trent's memory 6 years earlier. The call from the prosecutor felt like reliving her son's death all over again, the same shattering of hope, the same realization that justice remained elusive. "They're saying Shane's confession can't be used?" Tina asked, her voice hollow with disbelief. "That's correct. The Supreme Court has overturned the conviction and ordered a new trial." Outside the courthouse, protests erupted as news of the decision spread. Victims' rights advocates denounced the ruling as legal technicality trumping common sense, while civil liberties groups praised the court for protecting constitutional principles. Signs reading "Justice Denied" competed with banners proclaiming "Constitution Matters." The detective, now nearing retirement, felt the reversal like a physical blow. He had spent years building the case, convincing the ex-girlfriend to risk her safety, and watching the DeGiro family rebuild their lives around the hope of conviction. Now all of that work seemed meaningless. Ragland walked free on bail within hours of the decision, his confident smile captured by television cameras as he left the detention center. The defense attorney called the Supreme Court ruling a victory for constitutional principles and the presumption of innocence. The retrial was scheduled for 2004, but without the recorded confession, prosecutors faced the daunting task of proving murder based on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. The case that had once seemed certain now appeared to balance on a knife's edge between justice and legal technicality. For the DeGiro family, the court's decision represented something worse than losing a trial. It was the betrayal of their faith in the system itself. 2 years of legal preparation led to a quieter courtroom the second time around. Gone were the media circuses and protesters that had defined the first trial. In their place sat a smaller group of observers, watching as prosecutors attempted to prove murder without the confession that had anchored their previous case. The prosecutor, now graying at the temples from the stress of the appeals process, approached the jury with a different strategy. Without Ragland's recorded words, she would have to build her case piece by piece, using circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we cannot present certain evidence that was available in the previous trial, we can still prove beyond reasonable doubt that Shane Ragland murdered Trent DeGiro in cold blood," the prosecutor began. "The physical evidence, the witness testimony, and the defendant's own behavior paint a clear picture of guilt." The prosecution focused on ballistic evidence that matched Ragland's description of the shooting position. Expert witnesses testified about the precise angle required for the shot, the skill level necessary for such accuracy, and the calculated planning that preceded the murder. A new witness had emerged, a parking garage attendant who remembered seeing Ragland's car in the structure on the night of the shooting. "The defendant's vehicle was parked on the 3rd level at 2:45 a.m., the witness testified. "I remember because he seemed nervous when I checked his ticket. Most people don't hang around parking garages at that hour unless they're up to something." The defense attorney attacked this new evidence with renewed vigor, questioning the witness's memory after so many years and suggesting that coincidence was being twisted into conspiracy. Without the damning confession to overcome, he painted Ragland as a victim of prosecutorial obsession rather than a calculated killer. "The state has spent a decade trying to make my client fit their theory of this crime," the defense attorney argued. "They've ignored other suspects, dismissed alternative explanations, and now they're asking you to convict based on circumstantial evidence and the unreliable memories of witnesses who didn't come forward for years." The retrial proceeded at a different pace, methodical rather than explosive. Each piece of evidence was dissected, analyzed, and debated without the emotional weight of Raglan's own words hanging over the proceedings. Jurors took detailed notes, asking for evidence to be represented multiple times. Tina DiGiuro testified about her son's character and the impact of his loss. Her voice steady, despite the years of legal battles that had drained her family emotionally and financially. Trent was planning to graduate that December, she said. He wanted to teach high school football after his playing days ended. Someone stole all of that from him, and from us. The ballistics evidence remained compelling. The trajectory analysis showed the shot came from the parking garage at precisely the angle Raglan had described in his suppressed confession. But without those words to tie him to the scene, the prosecution struggled to establish motive and intent beyond reasonable doubt. The jury in the retrial deliberated for only 8 hours before returning with a verdict that satisfied no one completely. When the foreman stood to announce their decision, the packed courtroom held its collective breath, understanding that this moment would define the case's legacy. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant not guilty, the foreman announced. A gasp rippled through the gallery, but he continued, on the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. The split verdict reflected the jury's struggle with the evidence. They believed Raglan had killed Trent DiGiuro, but without the confession, they couldn't prove the premeditation necessary for first-degree murder. The manslaughter conviction carried a maximum sentence of 20 years, but with time served and good behavior credits, Raglan faced immediate release. Tina DiGiuro's face went ashen as the judge announced the sentence, time served. After 8 years of legal battles, her son's killer would walk free within hours. The courtroom erupted in angry shouts from Trent's supporters, while Raglan's family wept with relief. This is not justice, Tina whispered to her husband, watching as Raglan was released from custody immediately following the verdict. That man murdered our son and he's going home tonight. Outside the courthouse, the community's reaction was swift and divided. Local news ran headlines asking, "Justice dimmed?" While legal experts debated whether the jury had reached the right conclusion given the available evidence. Social media exploded with angry posts from those who believed Raglan had escaped true accountability. The prosecutor addressed reporters with barely contained frustration. While we're disappointed in the reduced charge, we respect the jury's decision. The important thing is that Shane Raglan has been held accountable for his actions, even if not to the full extent we sought. The defense attorney declared victory, arguing that the reduced conviction proved his client's innocence of premeditated murder. The jury saw through the state's circumstantial case and recognized that reasonable doubt existed. Justice has been served. But for many observers, the verdict felt like a compromise that satisfied neither the demands of justice nor the requirements of law. Raglan had been convicted of killing Trent DiGiuro, yet faced no additional punishment. The legal system had acknowledged his guilt while simultaneously setting him free. The detective, now months from retirement, watched the proceedings with the bitter knowledge that his greatest case had ended in legal limbo. He had given years of his life to finding Trent's killer, only to see the man walk away with minimal consequences. As Raglan left the courthouse, a free man, protesters lined the sidewalks with signs reading, "Justice failed" and "Remember Trent." The case that had gripped Kentucky for a decade was officially closed, but the questions it raised about justice, evidence, and the legal system would linger for years to come. In the months following Raglan's release, the ripple effects of the case continued to spread through Kentucky's legal and social landscape. Tina DiGiuro found herself at the center of a growing movement, demanding reform in how cold cases were investigated and prosecuted. The ex-girlfriend who had risked everything to bring forward the truth received death threats and was forced to relocate to another state. Her courage in wearing the wire had ultimately meant nothing in legal terms, but she had given the DiGiuro family something invaluable, the knowledge of who had killed their son and why. Raglan attempted to return to his normal life, but the notoriety of the case made that impossible. Former friends shunned him, employers refused to hire him, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Within 2 years, he was arrested again, this time for assault against a former girlfriend who had tried to leave him. The new charges revealed a pattern of violence that investigators wished they had uncovered during the original investigation. Court records showed multiple complaints of harassment, intimidation, and physical abuse spanning several years. The man who had killed Trent DiGiuro had continued to prey on others, his violence escalating when he felt challenged or rejected. Shane Raglan is exactly what we said. He was a dangerous man who uses violence to control situations, the detective told reporters after the assault arrest. The legal system may have failed Trent DeEuro, but at least now there's a record of what this man is capable of. For Tina DeEuro, Raglan's subsequent arrests provided both vindication and renewed grief. Her instincts about her son's killer had been correct, but that knowledge came at the cost of other women's suffering. She began speaking at domestic violence conferences, drawing connections between unchecked aggression and escalating criminal behavior. The University of Kentucky erected a memorial scholarship in Trent's name, funded by donations from across the state. The scholarship supported student athletes who demonstrated both academic excellence and community service, the qualities that had defined Trent's short life. Local media continued to revisit the case on anniversaries, often focusing on the legal questions it had raised about confession, evidence, and constitutional protections. Law schools used the trial transcripts as teaching materials, showing how the same set of facts could lead to vastly different outcomes depending on evidentiary rules. The porch where Trent died was eventually torn down during a campus renovation project, but students maintained a small memorial garden in its place. The light that had burned for so many years was replaced by a simple plaque reading, "Make every day count," the words found in Trent's locker and adopted as his unofficial motto. The detective retired 6 months after the retrial, carrying with him the frustration of a case that had consumed the final years of his career. He kept copies of the evidence files, occasionally reviewing them in hopes of finding something he had missed that might have changed the outcome. 5 years after Raglan's release, Tina DeEuro stood at a podium in the Kentucky State Capitol, addressing lawmakers about the need for legal reforms in cold case investigations. The Trent DeEuro Foundation had grown from a family's grief into a statewide advocacy organization, pushing for changes in how confession evidence was obtained and presented in court. "My son's killer confessed to his crime in detail, but legal technicalities allowed him to escape justice," Tina told the assembled legislators. "We need laws that protect constitutional rights while ensuring that victims' families can find closure when truth finally emerges." The proposed legislation would require specific protocols for undercover recordings, establish clearer guidelines for using relationship-based evidence, and provide additional protections for witnesses who came forward in cold cases. Legal experts debated the merits of the reforms, with some arguing they would encourage more witnesses to speak up, while others worried about further eroding defendants' rights. The bill passed by a narrow margin, becoming known as Trent's Law throughout Kentucky. While it couldn't change the outcome of his case, the legislation represented a tangible legacy, ensuring that future families might find the justice that had eluded the DeEuros. Meanwhile, Raglan's pattern of violence continued to escalate. His assault conviction had resulted in probation and anger management classes, but the underlying aggression remained unchecked. Former friends and acquaintances began coming forward with stories of his volatile behavior, painting a picture of a man whose capacity for violence had been evident long before Trent's murder. A documentary filmmaker approached the DeEuro family about telling their story, promising to focus on their journey rather than sensationalizing the crime itself. The resulting film, The Porch Light, won several awards at film festivals and helped raise awareness about the challenges facing cold case victims' families. The detective, now fully retired, served as a consultant on the documentary, sharing his insights about the investigation and the evidence that had ultimately proven insufficient for conviction. His decades of experience gave him a unique perspective on the case's place in the broader evolution of criminal justice. "This case taught me that solving a crime and achieving justice aren't always the same thing," he reflected during one interview. "We knew who killed Trent DeEuro, we had compelling evidence, but the legal system has its own requirements that don't always align with moral certainty." The South Oldham High School football team began a tradition of wearing special patches during their season opener each year, honoring Trent's memory and the values he had represented. Local sports reporters would often mention his story when covering the team, keeping his legacy alive for new generations of students who had never known him personally. As the years passed, the case became part of Kentucky folklore, a cautionary tale about justice delayed and the complex relationship between truth and legal procedure. True crime podcasts featured the story, legal scholars cited it in academic papers, and families of other cold case victims reached out to the DeEuros for guidance and support. 10 years after Trent's murder, the annual memorial vigil had become a community tradition. Hundreds of people gathered on the University of Kentucky campus each July 17th, lighting candles and sharing memories of a young man whose death had touched so many lives. The event had evolved beyond mourning into a celebration of resilience and a call for continued advocacy. Tina DeEuro addressed the crowd as she had every year, her voice stronger now, tempered by years of channeling grief into purpose. "Trent would be 31 today. she said, looking out at faces illuminated by candlelight. He'd probably be coaching high school football, maybe starting a family of his own. We can't bring him back, but we can honor his memory by never giving up the fight for justice. The Trent DeGiro Foundation had distributed more than 50 scholarships to student athletes across Kentucky, each recipient embodying the character traits that had defined its namesake. The foundation also funded victim advocacy programs and provided support for families navigating the criminal justice system. Shane Ragland had been arrested twice more since his manslaughter conviction, each incident involving allegations of violence or intimidation. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it, a man whose aggression had only intensified after escaping meaningful consequences for murder. His most recent arrest involved threatening a prosecutor who had worked on a domestic violence case, suggesting that his capacity for violence extended beyond personal relationships. The original detective maintained contact with the DeGiro family, attending the annual vigils and offering support during Ragland's subsequent legal troubles. His retirement had been shaped by the frustration of the case, but he found purpose in mentoring younger investigators and sharing the lessons learned from Trent's murder. "Every cold case is somebody's worst nightmare," he often told his protégés. "Our job isn't just to solve crimes, it's to help families find some measure of peace, even when the legal system falls short of perfect justice." The University of Kentucky had named its Victim Advocacy Center after Trent, recognizing the impact his story had on campus safety awareness and the treatment of crime victims. Student counselors received specialized training in trauma support, partly funded by the DeGiro Foundation's ongoing contributions. Legal scholars continued to debate the precedents set by Ragland's trials, particularly the Supreme Court's ruling on confession evidence. Some viewed the decision as necessary protection for constitutional rights, while others argued it had created loopholes that allowed guilty parties to escape accountability on technicalities. The case had influenced changes in how police departments approached cold case investigations, with new protocols for preserving evidence and documenting witness interviews. The detectives' meticulous case files became training materials for investigators across the region, showing how persistent investigation could uncover truth even years after a crime. As night fell over the vigil, participants formed a circle around the memorial garden where Trent's porch had once stood. The simple plaque bearing his motto, "Make every day count," caught the reflection of dozens of candles, creating a warm glow that seemed to embody the spirit of remembrance that had sustained his family through years of legal battles and personal loss. The journalist arrived at Tina DeGiro's home on a crisp October morning, 15 years after her son's murder. She had agreed to one final interview for a retrospective piece about cold cases and their impact on families, communities, and the justice system. The house remained much as it had been when Trent was alive, his photographs and trophies still displayed throughout the living room. "People ask me if I have closure now," Tina said, settling into the chair where she had received countless phone calls from investigators, lawyers, and reporters over the years. "I tell them that closure isn't something you find, it's something you create. We created purpose from our pain." The Trent DeGiro Foundation had become a model for victim advocacy organizations across the country. Its scholarship program had expanded to include academic as well as athletic achievement, and its legal advocacy work had influenced legislation in multiple states. The foundation's annual budget now exceeded $500,000, all raised through community donations and corporate sponsorships. Shane Ragland had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his latest assault conviction, his longest sentence since the manslaughter conviction for Trent's murder. The judge had cited his pattern of escalated violence when imposing the maximum penalty, noting that previous lenient sentences had failed to deter his criminal behavior. "I take no satisfaction in his continued arrests," Tina explained. "Every time Shane hurts someone else, it reminds me that our legal system failed to protect society when it had the chance. If he had received a life sentence for murdering Trent, those other women wouldn't have suffered." The detective had passed away 2 years earlier, taking with him institutional knowledge about dozens of unsolved cases. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through his work, including the DeGiro family, who considered him an honorary member despite his inability to secure the conviction they had hoped for. The journalist asked about forgiveness, a question Tina had fielded countless times over the years. Her answer remained consistent: "I don't forgive Shane Ragland because forgiveness would imply that what he did was somehow acceptable. I've found peace, but that's different from forgiveness. Peace comes from knowing we did everything possible to seek justice and that Trent's story continues to make a difference." The University of Kentucky had established an endowment fund in Trent's name, ensuring that his memorial scholarship would continue indefinitely. The fund had grown to over $2 million through donations from alumni, local businesses, and national organizations that had learned his story through media coverage and advocacy work. Each year's scholarship recipients were required to perform community service and maintain academic excellence, creating a ripple effect of positive impact that extended far beyond the original tragedy. Many recipients had gone on to careers in law enforcement, social work, and education, carrying forward the values that Trent had embodied. The porch light that had burned for so many years had been replaced by something more permanent, a legacy of advocacy, education, and community service that would outlive everyone touched by the original crime. On a quiet Sunday evening 25 years after the shooting, Tina DiGiro walked slowly through the University of Kentucky campus toward the memorial garden where her son had died. The original apartment building was long gone, replaced by modern student housing, but the garden remained a small oasis of remembrance in the midst of ongoing campus life. The plaque reading, "Make Every Day Count," had been polished recently by groundskeeping staff who had maintained the memorial for over a decade. Fresh flowers lay beside it, left by visitors who continued to find meaning in Trent's story despite never having known him personally. Tina knelt beside the plaque, her movements slower now, but her resolve unchanged. At 73, she had stepped back from day-to-day operations of the foundation, but her passion for victim advocacy remained undiminished. Her hair was completely gray now, her face lined with years of grief and determination, but her eyes still held the fierce love that had driven her decades-long fight for justice. "I kept my promise," she whispered to the memorial. "I never let them forget you." The Trent DiGiro Foundation had awarded its 200th scholarship the previous spring, reaching a milestone that seemed impossible in those early days of grief and legal battles. Recipients now included doctors, teachers, police officers, and social workers, young people whose lives had been shaped by the story of a football player they had never met but whose values they carried forward. Shane Ragland had died in prison 3 years earlier, his life ended by the same violence he had inflicted on others. A fellow inmate, angered by Ragland's boasts about escaping justice for murder, had killed him during a confrontation in the prison yard. The news had reached Tina through a brief phone call from a victims' rights advocate, offering her the opportunity to make a statement. She had declined. "My son's story was never about Shane Ragland," she had told the caller. "It was about making sure Trent's life meant something beyond the way it ended." The campus around her buzzed with the energy of a new semester. Students walked past the memorial garden on their way to classes, most unaware of the tragedy that had occurred on this spot decades earlier. But some paused to read the plaque, and a few left flowers or notes, evidence that Trent's story continued to resonate with new generations. The detective's replacement had visited the memorial the previous year, bringing news that new DNA testing had finally confirmed what everyone had known, that Ragland had indeed been at the scene of the crime. The evidence had come too late for legal proceedings but provided scientific validation for the family's long fight for recognition of the truth. As darkness fell over Lexington, the streetlights illuminated the memorial garden in a soft glow. Tina stood slowly, her hand resting briefly on the plaque that bore her son's words. Above her, the lights of student apartments twinkled like stars, each window representing dreams and possibilities that Trent would never experience but had helped inspire in others through his legacy. She walked back toward her car, carrying with her the knowledge that love could indeed outlast loss, that purpose could emerge from pain, and that a single life, even one cut tragically short, could continue to matter long after the last light went out.